Tonight, a single sentence spoken in a language almost no one in the room understood would stop a billionaire's laughter, silence an entire restaurant, and expose a truth powerful enough to change 3 lives forever. He thought he was ordering food. He thought he was showing off. He thought no one there could understand him. But he was wrong. Because the quiet waitress he tried to humiliate wasn't just listening. She was translating every word, every insult, and every secret he never meant for the world to hear. And what she said back would leave him frozen in front of hundreds of people. Welcome to the channel where shocking truths, emotional stories, and unbelievable moments collide. Here, we bring you powerful storytelling that proves appearances can deceive, silence can be strength, and one unexpected moment can change everything. If you love dramatic real-life style stories filled with suspense, emotional twists, and unforgettable endings, you're in the right place. And if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories you'll hear on this channel are not just stories, they are experiences you won't want to miss. Now, let's step inside the moment where pride met truth, and one simple reply changed everything. The night air outside Aurora Crown restaurant shimmered with luxury. Crystal chandeliers glowed through tall glass windows. Valet attendants rushed between sleek black cars. Inside, polished marble floors reflected soft golden lighting, and the quiet sound of violin music floated between tables filled with the city's elite. Aurora Crown wasn't just a restaurant. It was a symbol. Power brokers closed million-dollar deals there. Celebrities celebrated private victories. And tonight, it would host a man known for controlling industries the same way he controlled people. Ethan Cole. A tech billionaire whose rise had been as fast as it was ruthless. At 38, he owned companies that stretched across continents. His influence shaped markets. His confidence filled rooms before he even spoke. But behind the tailored suits and calm smile, Ethan carried a reputation. He loved control. He loved dominance. And he especially loved proving he was always the smartest man in the room. "Mr. Cole has arrived," whispered the maître d' as staff straightened their uniforms instantly. The restaurant's atmosphere shifted. Conversations softened. Heads turned. Ethan walked in with effortless authority. His dark navy suit was perfectly tailored. His watch alone cost more than most people's yearly salary. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes carried calculation, scanning, judging, measuring. Trailing behind him were 3 business associates and 2 security guards who kept a respectful distance. Ethan barely acknowledged the attention he received. To him, admiration was expected. He slid into the center table prepared specifically for him. "Welcome back, Mr. Cole," the manager said with a respectful bow. Ethan nodded casually. "Let's make tonight quick. I have investors waiting after this." Menus were presented immediately. Crystal glasses filled with sparkling water. Every movement around him was precise, rehearsed, perfect. And then she arrived. Her name was Amora. 26 years old. Calm presence. White uniform pressed neatly. Dark brown hair pulled into a simple bun. Her posture carried quiet professionalism, but her eyes held something deeper. Something observant. Something thoughtful. She had worked at Aurora Crown for 2 years. Known by staff as reliable, respectful, invisible. Amora stepped toward the table with her notepad held gently in her hands. "Good evening, sir. I'll be assisting your table tonight." Ethan barely looked up. He was scrolling through his phone, reading market updates. One of his associates leaned forward with a smirk. "You always get the best service here, Ethan." Ethan finally glanced at Amora, just briefly. His expression revealed nothing. No curiosity. No acknowledgement. Just assessment. "Fine," he said casually. "Take the order." Amora nodded politely. "Of course, sir." She stood silently as Ethan's associates began selecting dishes. Her pen moved smoothly across her pad. Her voice remained soft and professional as she confirmed each order. Then Ethan leaned back in his chair, folded his hands together, and spoke, but not in English. He switched to an extremely rare regional dialect, one almost forgotten outside isolated communities. His associates chuckled quietly. They had heard him do this before. Ethan enjoyed speaking in languages he believed no one around him could understand. It made him feel superior, untouchable. He spoke slowly, deliberately, looking directly at Amora as he ordered. His tone carried something beneath the elegance. Mockery. He described the food he wanted, but inserted subtle insults within the dialect. Comments about her status, her job, her presumed lack of education. His associate smirked, assuming she had no idea. Amora stood still. Her face remained calm. Her pen continued moving. But her heartbeat shifted. Because she understood every single word. She had grown up hearing that dialect from her grandfather, a man who insisted language was more than communication. It was identity, history, respect. And now, she was hearing it used like a weapon. She finished writing the order and lifted her eyes toward Ethan. For a brief moment, their gazes locked. He expected confusion. He expected submission. Instead, Amora simply nodded politely. "Thank you, sir. I'll place your order immediately." She turned and walked toward the kitchen, her steps controlled, measured, professional. But inside, something had awakened. Something she had spent years learning to silence. And across the restaurant, Ethan leaned back with quiet satisfaction. He believed he had just entertained himself. He had no idea that the woman he tried to humiliate had understood everything. And he definitely had no idea that this simple interaction had already set something in motion that would soon shake his confidence and expose truths he never planned to reveal. Inside the kitchen, the controlled chaos of Aurora Crown continued as chefs plated dishes with artistic precision. Flames rose from sauté pans. Orders were called across stainless steel counters. The air smelled of butter, garlic, and expensive spices. Amora handed the order ticket to the head chef. "Priority table," she said softly. The chef nodded immediately. "Mr. Cole again?" "Yes." He sighed knowingly. "Everything perfect, as always." Amora nodded and stepped back, but her mind was no longer focused on routine service. Ethan's words echoed in her thoughts. Each insult disguised behind elegant pronunciation. Each assumption led inside sophisticated speech. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. Professionalism first. Always. She returned to the dining floor carrying a tray of appetizers. Her posture remained flawless. Her expression remained neutral. But Ethan noticed something. Not weakness. Not discomfort. Control. It unsettled him slightly, though he couldn't explain why. As she placed the dishes down, one of Ethan's associates laughed. "Ethan was just telling us how many languages he speaks now," he said casually. "You wouldn't believe how many he's mastered." Ethan smirked modestly. "Languages are power. Most people limit themselves to one or two. I prefer to explore." Amora placed the final plate gently in front of him. "That's very impressive, sir," she replied calmly. Her voice carried respect, but something else lingered beneath it. Something Ethan almost caught, but dismissed instantly. Ethan leaned forward again, switching back into the rare dialect. He began speaking to his associates, intentionally louder this time. His words sounded musical, refined, but inside them lived arrogance. He joked about people who served others. About how intelligence created hierarchy. About how society naturally separated leaders from followers. His associates laughed again, assuming their conversation remained private. Other guests continued dining, unaware of the exchange happening at the center table. Amora stood beside them, refilling glasses, adjusting plates, moving with perfect composure. Yet every sentence he spoke landed clearly in her mind. The tension began building, quietly, invisibly. Ethan paused mid-sentence and looked directly at her again. He spoke one final phrase in the dialect, slower this time, sharper, almost daring. It was a direct insult. A statement suggesting someone in her position could never understand ambition, success, or intelligence. Silence followed. A long, heavy silence. The violin music in the background seemed louder. Glasses clinked softly at nearby tables. Amora finished pouring water into his glass. She placed the bottle down gently. Then she lifted her gaze, meeting Ethan's eyes fully for the first time. And she spoke. In the same rare dialect. Fluent. Clear. Elegant. Her words flowed with calm authority, perfectly structured, culturally precise. She politely corrected his grammar. She subtly challenged his assumptions. And she delivered one statement that carried devastating quiet strength. She told him that language was not meant to divide intelligence, but to reveal character. The entire table froze. His associates stared at her in disbelief. Ethan's expression cracked for the first time that night. He had expected embarrassment. He had expected submission. He had never expected equality. The restaurant around them continued moving, unaware that something seismic had just occurred at table 7. Amora finished speaking and returned to English smoothly. "Your main course will arrive shortly, sir." She stepped back gracefully and turned toward the kitchen again. Behind her, Ethan remained frozen. For the first time in years, he felt exposed. Not by anger. Not by confrontation. But by calm intelligence he never saw coming. And as his associates slowly exchanged stunned glances, Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring toward the kitchen entrance where Amora had disappeared. Because something about that moment unsettled him deeper than humiliation. It intrigued him. And curiosity had always been the one emotion Ethan Cole never ignored. What he didn't realize was that this curiosity would pull him into a story far more complicated than pride. And far more dangerous than he could imagine. The air around Ethan Laurent's table thickened with a silence that felt heavier than the polished marble floors beneath it. His business associates exchanged uncertain glances, their confident laughter from moments earlier now replaced with cautious whispers. The rare dialect he had used moments ago still lingered in the room like an invisible fog. To them, it had sounded impressive. Sophisticated. Untouchable. To Amina, it had sounded like war. From behind the kitchen doors, she stood perfectly still, her fingers gripping the silver tray so tightly her knuckles turned pale. The rhythmic clatter of dishes and murmured orders faded into distant noise as memories she had spent years burying clawed their way back to the surface. The dialect Ethan had spoken wasn't just rare. It was sacred. It was the language her grandmother used when telling bedtime stories in a candlelit village hut. It was the language whispered during weddings, sung during funerals, and spoken only among elders trusted to carry generational knowledge. And Ethan had twisted it into mockery. Amina inhaled slowly, forcing her pulse to steady. She placed the tray down, her reflection staring back at her from the polished steel counter. For a moment, she saw not a waitress in a pressed uniform, but a young girl sitting beside an elderly woman weaving stories beneath a fading sunset. "You must protect our words," her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "Because when language is lost, history dies with it." A sharp voice snapped her back to the present. "Amina! Table 12 is asking for their wine refill," another server called. She nodded automatically, stepping back onto the restaurant floor. Her posture was composed, her expression professional. Yet something inside her had shifted. Something that refused to stay buried any longer. Across the dining hall, Ethan swirled his glass of Bordeaux lazily, his smirk returning as he spoke to his colleagues. "You see," he said confidently, "power isn't just money. Power is knowing things others don't. Speaking languages others can't." His companions nodded, impressed. Vanessa, seated beside him, forced a polite smile, though her eyes betrayed unease. She had noticed the tension in Amina's shoulders when Ethan spoke earlier. She had seen the flicker of something raw and wounded flash across the waitress's face. And it unsettled her. Amina approached the table quietly, refilling their glasses with careful precision. Ethan barely acknowledged her presence. Until she spoke. Her voice was calm. Even. Controlled. "Your pronunciation," she said softly, "is slightly incorrect." The words fell into the conversation like a stone breaking glass. Ethan froze. His colleagues blinked in confusion. Vanessa's eyes widened instantly. Slowly, Ethan turned toward her, disbelief flickering across his face. "I beg your pardon," he asked, his tone sharpening. Amina met his gaze with steady composure. "The dialect you were speaking," she continued politely, "you mispronounced several tonal markers. In that language, those changes alter meaning entirely. A ripple of awkward laughter moved through the table. One of the men leaned back in his chair, clearly entertained. Ethan forced a smile, though irritation crept into his voice. "And how exactly would you know that?" The question hung between them, thick with condescension. Amina hesitated. For the briefest moment, doubt flickered across her expression. Her eyes drifted toward the exit hallway leading to the employee lockers, toward the life she had built carefully, quietly, safely. She thought about her rent, her younger brother's tuition, her immigration paperwork still being processed. Speaking up could cost everything. But staying silent would cost something else. Something deeper. She straightened slightly. "My grandmother was one of the last cultural historians of that dialect," she said. "She spent her life preserving it before she passed away." The table went still. Ethan's smirk faded, just slightly. "That's convenient," he replied coldly. Amina nodded respectfully, though her voice remained firm. "It is also the reason I understand what you said earlier, sir." Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Ethan leaned forward slowly, his eyes narrowing. "And what exactly do you believe you heard?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The entire surrounding section of the restaurant seemed to quiet instinctively, as though sensing tension rising beneath the surface. Amina inhaled. The room felt smaller, warmer, suffocating. "You described me," she said carefully, "as someone unworthy of standing in the presence of people like you." Silence crashed over the table. One of Ethan's associates coughed awkwardly. Another reached for his drink but stopped halfway. Vanessa stared at Ethan, her expression slowly shifting from curiosity to discomfort. Ethan's jaw tightened, his polished billionaire composure beginning to fracture. "You misunderstood," he said quickly, though the defensive edge in his tone betrayed him. Amina shook her head gently. "No, sir," she replied. "I understood perfectly." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. For the first time that evening, Ethan Laurent felt something unfamiliar creeping beneath his confidence. Uncertainty. He leaned back in his chair, studying her as if seeing her for the first time. Not as a waitress, but as a threat. Around them, silverware clinked softly. Conversations resumed cautiously. Yet an invisible current of attention lingered around their table. Vanessa slowly lowered her napkin onto her lap, her gaze flicking between Ethan and Amina as realization began forming behind her eyes. Amina gave a small, professional nod. "Will there be anything else I can assist you with this evening?" she asked calmly. Ethan stared at her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, a calculating smile returned to his lips. "Yes," he said quietly. "There is." And something in his voice made Vanessa's stomach drop. Because whatever Ethan Laurent was about to do next, it was not going to be kind. The tension around Ethan Laurent's table tightened like a drawn bowstring. His fingers tapped slowly against the crystal stem of his wine glass, each soft click echoing louder than the orchestra playing gently in the background. The calculating smile resting on his lips no longer looked charming. It looked dangerous. His colleagues leaned forward slightly, sensing entertainment or disaster. Vanessa, however, felt a cold knot forming in her chest. She had seen this version of Ethan before. The version that appeared when his pride was wounded. And it never ended quietly. Ethan exhaled slowly before speaking again, his voice smooth, controlled, almost pleasant. "Since you claim such expertise," he said, tilting his head toward Amina, "perhaps you can translate something else for us." Amina remained still, her posture straight, her tray balanced effortlessly in her hand. But beneath the calm surface, her pulse hammered violently against her ribs. "What would you like translated, sir?" she asked politely. Ethan reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out his phone. The screen glowed against the dim candlelight as he scrolled through something carefully. Vanessa leaned closer, her brow furrowing. "Ethan," she murmured cautiously. "Let it go." He ignored her. After a moment, he turned the phone toward Amina. On the screen displayed an ancient handwritten manuscript, photographed from what looked like a private archive. "This," he said smugly, "is a ceremonial oath written in your dialect. It was purchased from a private collector in Morocco. Extremely rare. Extremely valuable. Several of his colleagues nodded in impressed approval. I paid nearly $200,000 for access to its translation, Ethan continued, his eyes glinting with challenge. And even then, scholars struggled to interpret parts of it. He leaned forward slightly. But perhaps you can do better. The surrounding diners were beginning to notice the scene unfolding. Conversations softened. Glasses paused mid-air. Attention drifted toward the confrontation building at the center of the restaurant. Amina stepped closer to read the text. The moment her eyes landed on the manuscript, her breath caught. It wasn't just ceremonial. It was sacred leadership doctrine. A document passed through generations only to tribal guardians, elders entrusted with guiding entire communities through war, famine, and migration. Her grandmother had spoken about texts like this. And seeing it displayed casually on a billionaire's phone felt like watching someone parade stolen history as decoration. Ethan studied her expression, mistaking her shock for intimidation. Well? He pressed. Amina hesitated. Every instinct told her to step away. To apologize. To retreat safely behind professionalism. This was far beyond her role as a server. But then she noticed something Ethan clearly had not. His translation notes, displayed beneath the manuscript. They were wrong. Dangerously wrong. She swallowed slowly. This is not an oath, she said quietly. Ethan's smile froze. It is, he corrected confidently. According to 3 academic consultants. Amina shook her head. No, sir, she replied carefully. It is a warning. A visible ripple passed across the table. Vanessa straightened immediately. A warning about what? One of the businessmen asked, leaning closer. Amina glanced down at the script again, her voice lowering as if speaking it demanded respect. It describes the fall of leaders who used knowledge as power, instead of responsibility. Ethan let out a short laugh, though irritation flickered beneath it. That's a very poetic interpretation, he said sharply. But entirely incorrect. Amina raised her eyes slowly. It also describes, she continued, how those leaders were removed by their own people when they dishonored sacred traditions. The laughter at the table faded completely. Vanessa stared at the phone again, then at Ethan. Is she right? She asked quietly. Ethan's jaw flexed. Of course not, he snapped. She's improvising. Amina inhaled carefully, choosing her next words with surgical precision. There is a phrase repeated 3 times in the text, she explained. It translates roughly to, the one who sells the voice of ancestors will eventually lose his own. Silence dropped like shattered glass. Across the dining room, even the waitstaff had slowed their movement, sensing the electric shift in atmosphere. One of Ethan's partners cleared his throat. Ethan, who translated this for you? Ethan didn't answer immediately. For the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered openly across his face. His eyes darted back to the phone, scanning the text again as if seeing it through an entirely new lens. Vanessa leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. You told investors this manuscript proved your cultural preservation project was historically accurate. His silence confirmed everything. The realization spread across the table like wildfire. If Amina was correct, Ethan hadn't just misunderstood an artifact. He had built an entire philanthropic brand, a global foundation, millions in donations, academic partnerships, around a mistranslated sacred text. And the waitress he tried to humiliate had just exposed it. Ethan slowly locked his phone screen, his movements stiff, mechanical. You're done speaking, he said coldly. Amina didn't move. Around them, diners had fully turned their attention toward the table now. Several phones were discreetly recording. The restaurant manager hovered nervously near the bar, unsure whether to intervene. Vanessa pushed her chair back slightly, her expression pale but resolute. Ethan, she said quietly, if she's telling the truth, this could destroy everything. He stood abruptly, his chair screeching across the marble floor. The entire restaurant froze. His towering presence cast a long shadow over Amina as he stepped closer, his voice lowering into a sharp, venomous whisper only partially hidden from the watching crowd. You have no idea who you're embarrassing, he said. Amina met his gaze steadily. And you have no idea, she replied softly, what you've been disrespecting. The words landed with surgical precision. And in that moment, Ethan Laurent realized something terrifying. The power in the room had shifted. And he was no longer the one controlling it. For a long, suffocating second, no one in La Reserve moved. The soft piano music floating through the restaurant suddenly felt misplaced, almost absurd, like elegance attempting to coexist with a storm that had already broken through the walls. Ethan Laurent stood towering over Amina, his perfectly tailored suit now looking like armor that had begun to crack. His breathing had grown shallow, uneven, and the polished billionaire composure he had spent decades perfecting was slipping, piece by fragile piece. "You're finished here," he said finally, his voice low and trembling with restrained fury. "You don't get to stand in my presence and fabricate stories about artifacts you don't understand." Amina remained still, but inside, fear pulsed through her veins like electricity. She knew the power he held. One complaint, one accusation, and her job, her stability, could disappear overnight. But something deeper anchored her. Something older than fear. "I am not fabricating anything," she said calmly. "That document is not meant to be displayed or sold. It is meant to be protected." A murmur spread across nearby tables. Ethan turned sharply toward his associates, forcing a confident chuckle that sounded hollow, brittle. "You see," he said loudly, raising his hand slightly. "This is exactly why emotional storytelling and academic integrity don't mix. She's projecting mythology onto verified historical material." But the room wasn't laughing anymore. His investors were exchanging uneasy glances. One man discreetly pulled out his phone and began scrolling rapidly, likely searching for references, confirmations, damage control. Vanessa slowly stood beside the table, her chair sliding back with a quiet scrape. "Ethan," she said carefully, her voice carrying unexpected firmness, "who authenticated that manuscript?" "I told you already," he snapped. "Consultants. Experts." "Names," she pressed. The single word hung in the air like a blade. Ethan hesitated. It lasted less than a second. But everyone saw it. Amina watched Vanessa's expression shift from concern to realization. "You rushed the acquisition, didn't you?" Vanessa said quietly. "You wanted the publicity before verification was complete." "That's ridiculous," Ethan barked. One of his senior partners leaned forward slowly, his face tightening with controlled concern. "Ethan," the man said carefully, "our foundation's entire preservation campaign is tied to this manuscript. The international grant review happens next month." The weight of those words landed like thunder. Across the restaurant, whispers were no longer subtle. The atmosphere buzzed with rising curiosity, suspicion, and quiet judgment. Amina lowered her gaze briefly, then spoke again, softer this time, but far more dangerous. "There is one more line in the document," she said. Ethan turned toward her sharply, his patience fracturing completely. "You've said enough. It warns," she continued gently, "that those who misuse sacred knowledge will not only lose authority, they will lose legacy." The word legacy struck him harder than anything else she had said. Ethan Laurent had spent 20 years constructing his public image, the cultured billionaire, the humanitarian patron, the global ambassador of preservation and education. His name was carved into museum wings, university scholarships, and humanitarian campaigns. Legacy was everything. And suddenly, it felt fragile. Vanessa stepped closer to Amina, studying her face carefully. "How do you know all of this?" she asked quietly. Amina hesitated. The restaurant held its breath again. "My grandmother," she said softly, "was one of the last living guardians of that dialect's ceremonial traditions. She taught me before she passed away." The sincerity in her voice silenced the room in a way no authority ever could. Vanessa slowly turned back toward Ethan, her eyes searching his face, as if hoping he would offer proof, reassurance, certainty. He offered none. Instead, anger replaced calculation completely. "You're done," he repeated, louder now. "Manager!" The word snapped across the dining hall like a gunshot. Within seconds, the restaurant manager hurried forward, his face pale with panic. Yes, Mr. Laurent. This employee has disrupted a private client discussion, Ethan declared, his voice now theatrical, commanding, designed to reassert dominance. I want her removed immediately. The manager froze, caught between two impossible forces, a billionaire patron and a room full of witnesses silently observing every second. Amina felt her chest tighten. For a brief moment, doubt whispered inside her. Maybe she had gone too far. Maybe truth didn't matter here. But before the manager could respond, a voice rose from across the restaurant. Excuse me. All eyes turned. An elderly North African woman seated near the wine display stood slowly, leaning on a polished ebony cane. Her silver hair shimmered beneath the chandelier lights, and her dignified posture carried quiet authority that commanded instant attention. She stepped forward deliberately, her gaze locking onto Ethan with unsettling calm. That dialect, she said, her accent rich and unmistakable, is from my region. Amina's heart skipped. The woman turned toward her, studying her carefully, then gave a slow, approving nod. She speaks truth. Gasps rippled across the room. The woman continued walking forward until she stood beside Amina. I am Professor Zahra Ben Youssef, she announced, her voice steady. Cultural historian. UNESCO consultant on North African oral preservation. The restaurant fell into stunned silence. And Mr. Laurent, she continued, her gaze sharpening, if that manuscript is what I believe it is, then it was never meant to leave its community. Its sale alone is questionable. Ethan's face drained of color completely. Phones lifted higher. Investors exchanged alarmed looks. Vanessa took a slow step backward from Ethan, her expression collapsing into disbelief. You told us this project was fully ethical, she whispered. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in his life, wealth, status, influence, none of it could construct an escape fast enough. And standing before him was not just a waitress. It was truth. And truth had just found witnesses. The silence inside La Reserve no longer felt tense. It felt irreversible. Ethan Laurent stood frozen between two worlds, the one he had carefully built through power, money, and prestige, and the one collapsing around him under the quiet weight of truth. Professor Zahra Ben Youssef's presence alone had shifted the gravity of the room. Her reputation carried decades of academic authority and cultural preservation work recognized across continents. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Mr. Laurent, she said calmly, cultural artifacts are not trophies. They are living histories. When removed from their guardians without proper authorization, they lose context. And sometimes, they lose meaning entirely. Every word landed with surgical precision. Across the table, Ethan's senior partners exchanged tense glances. One of them leaned toward another, whispering urgently while scrolling through his phone. The fragile confidence that had surrounded Ethan minutes earlier was dissolving into visible panic. Vanessa watched him carefully, her expression hollowed by disappointment. You told us the manuscript was acquired through a preservation partnership, she said quietly. It was, Ethan insisted, though his voice lacked its former certainty. The transaction was legal. Legal, Professor Zahra repeated slowly, does not always mean ethical. The restaurant air felt heavier. The manager, still standing nearby, swallowed nervously, unsure whether to speak or disappear entirely. Amina remained still, her heart pounding against her ribs. She hadn't planned for this moment to unfold the way it had. She had only intended to protect something sacred, something her grandmother had entrusted to memory and language before passing it forward. She lowered her gaze briefly, remembering her grandmother's voice echoing across warm desert evenings, whispering that knowledge was never meant to humiliate, only to illuminate. Vanessa suddenly stepped away from Ethan's side completely. I'm withdrawing my endorsement from the manuscript unveiling, she said firmly. The statement dropped like a detonator. One of Ethan's investors leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples slowly. We need to pause the entire exhibition, he added. Immediately. Ethan turned sharply toward them, desperation flickering through his composure. You're overreacting, he snapped. This is a misunderstanding fueled by dramatics. But the confidence was gone. The room could feel it. Professor Zura turned gently toward Amina. Where did you learn the ceremonial form so precisely? She asked. Amina hesitated, emotion tightening her throat. My grandmother, she said softly. She believed the dialect was disappearing. She taught me so it would survive, even if no one else remembered. A faint smile warmed the professor's face. Then she succeeded. The words hit Amina harder than she expected. Her eyes shimmered, but she steadied herself, refusing to break in front of strangers. Across the dining hall, a few guests began quietly applauding, hesitant at first, then growing stronger as more joined. It wasn't admiration for confrontation. It was recognition. Recognition of courage. Recognition of preservation. Recognition of dignity standing its ground against arrogance. Ethan stared around the room, realizing too late that he had lost the audience he believed he controlled. Without another word, he reached for his jacket, his movements stiff and mechanical. The tailored fabric that once symbolized power now looked heavy, almost suffocating. He turned toward the exit, walking faster than his usual calculated stride. For the first time, he didn't acknowledge anyone watching him leave. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality. The storm had passed. But its impact lingered in the air like electricity after lightning. The manager finally approached Amina, his expression conflicted but sincere. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. I should have stepped in sooner. Amina nodded gently. I understand the pressure, she replied. But truth should never depend on who has the bigger wallet. He lowered his eyes, accepting the lesson. Professor Zura reached into her purse and handed Amina a small embossed card. We are launching an International Preservation Fellowship next spring, she said. We need linguists who understand both scholarship and cultural responsibility. I would like you to apply. Amina stared at the card, her fingers trembling slightly as she accepted it. Thank you, she whispered. Do not thank me, the professor replied softly. Thank your grandmother and your courage. Later that night, Amina stepped outside the restaurant into the cool city air. The noise of traffic hummed steadily around her, but inside, everything felt quieter, clearer. Her phone vibrated in her apron pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from her mother. Your grandmother would be proud of you. Amina smiled, a tear finally escaping as she looked up at the city skyline glowing against the night sky. Language had been used as a weapon against her. But tonight, it had become her shield. Her inheritance. Her voice. And sometimes, the greatest power is not wealth, not influence, not status. Sometimes, it is simply knowing who you are, and refusing to let the world rewrite it. If this story reminded you that dignity is louder than arrogance, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Stories like this prove that ordinary people can change extraordinary moments. And before you go, tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to stand your ground when no one expected you to? Because your story might inspire someone else to find their voice too. Until next time, remember this. The loudest people in the room are not always the strongest. Sometimes, strength speaks quietly and still changes everything.